Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So this week we spent a lot of time talking about earthquakes in Jamaica, and I told you I would try to get in touch with Professor Simon Mitchell of the UWI, and we did get a hold of him. We did interview him, and now we're going to bring to you that interview. So watch, learn, educate yourself, make your comments in the comment section, and share the video. Subscribe to this channel so we could get the word out more to persons who are interested in what's going on with Jamaica and Earth.
Well, I'm a geologist. I teach at the University of the West Indies at Mona. I've actually been in Jamaica for about 28 years now, and in that time, I've looked at pretty much the whole of the island, and that's involved working out the geology, mapping across the island, recording the geology, and along with that, of course, it's recording the faults and basically mapping out the faults. I've also worked with the earthquake unit here. I was in charge of it for 6 years, and I continue to work with them and to try and explain as far as I can to anybody who's interested what the geology is, what the problems are with geology, what happens when we have faults, and why not just Jamaica, but different parts of the Caribbean are affected by faults. Jamaica experiences quite a few earthquakes, not as many as other places, but it does have a number. There are two big ones in historical times. The first big one was 1692, which is known as the Port Royal earthquake, and destroyed the city of Port Royal at the time, pretty much destroyed it. Half of it fell off into the water and is now buried basically by the water. And there have been documentaries on it where they sort of drain it and do these sorts of things and show what's actually down there. So that was the biggest. The second one was 1907, when you had the Kingston earthquake, and the Kingston earthquake. The devastation was twofold in that one. The first one was the damage caused by the shaking, and the second one was the fact that at the time the city was basically lit by gas. And of course, what happened was the gas pipes ruptured, caught fire, and you had a lot of fires. Similar, the previous year, you had the same thing in San Francisco, just because that's how lights were basically created at that time. So that was really the last big one, 1907, but there have been a series of others that have come subsequently to that. There was one in Montego Bay, 1957. That's often known as the Montego Bay earthquake. And then there was a 1993 that affected Kingston, caused damage to roads, a little bit of damage to buildings. And then you've had some more recent ones. There was a 2005, which most people don't even know it occurred because it was out in the country. So it wasn't really felt in any of the large towns. And then, of course, this year, or late last year, perhaps is a better way of putting it, we had the 5.6, which is the one that is certainly is a bit concerning, which is in the Blue Mountains, and that did not have a foreshock. It just happened as a big bang, and there were about 200 earthquakes in the next 2 or 3 days afterwards. Quakes are really when energy is released because a fault moves. And a fault is a break within the ground, anywhere within the crust, and it can go from very shallow to really quite deep. So if you're talking about Jamaica, you might be going down to 30 kilometers. But where you get subduction zones, so when you've got volcanoes, for instance, it can be much deeper because the subducting plate in those settings can go down much, much deeper. So you can get earthquakes down to hundreds of kilometers. But it really depends on where your particular island, continent, or whatever it happens to be is, and that really dictates what sort of earthquakes you're going to get. Now, I said that it's a release of energy, and the magnitude is the actual amount of energy, a measure of the energy that's released. Now, one of the things to remember is that the magnitude scale is what we call a logarithmic scale. So going from 1 to 2 is 10 times. Going from 1 to 3 is 100 times. So each time you go up, it's 10 times more. So that's why when you get relatively small earthquakes, it doesn't seem to be that much. But then as you start getting them bigger, so when you start getting 5s and 6s and 7s, they seem to be much, much more deadly. And the reason is because much more energy is being released, because it's 10 times each time you're going up. So, once you get into that 5 times, you're going to be feeling it, providing it's shallow, and we'll come on to that. Once you get into 6, it's becoming noticeable. And when you get into 7, you're talking about these very destructive ones. And they can get up to about 9. The very biggest ones ever reported are about 9. So that's up in Alaska, that sort of area, or on the coast of places like Chile.
So
Those are the places that have the biggest sorts of, or the biggest earthquakes that have been reported.
so here's a question, because you just mentioned something and it came up in one of the questions. Earthquakes, do they occur just below the surface or deep below the surface? Because that was one of the questions, and I think you just went into it briefly there. And
Yeah,
also there was another question aligned with that: can the ground open up during an earthquake?
okay. So the first thing is, they can be very shallow, so they can be basically at the surface, or they can be very, very deep. And it's just a question of which bit of the fault moves. We'll come to the ground in a second, but you also asked about intensity. And the difference between intensity and magnitude is the actual energy released, whereas the intensity is effectively the damage done at the surface. So if you've got an earthquake which is very close to the surface, most of that energy is at the surface. Whereas if you've got an earthquake very deep, the actual waves have to travel a long way up through the actual ground before they reach the surface. So the actual effect is going to be less. So the intensity, if you like, is really what the damage is done by an earthquake. And that is going to be dependent, firstly, on the magnitude, but also particularly on the depth. There's another thing in there which also affects this, and that is the nature of the rocks. Rocks which are soft, unconsolidated, so sands and gravels, alluvial type things, they amplify the seismic waves. So if you're living in areas like that, which of course are flat, and then people do tend to live in those, you get an amplification going on top. So that is why, particularly like places like Kingston in Jamaica, feel a lot of earthquakes, is because of this amplification as well. Now, if your earthquakes are deep, invariably you're not going to see any ruptures at the surface. But if they are shallow, they can actually rupture, and you can actually get displacements actually on the surface. And if you get what we call liquefaction, so when you get some of these sands, if they liquefy, then fissures can open up in those, and people can fall in them, of course.
Okay, and you mentioned displacement. What exactly is displacement?
Okay, the displacement, it can happen in different directions, but really it comes down to plate tectonics. So the surface of the Earth is made up of different plates, and those plates are moving against each other. Now, the movements can be towards each other, away from each other, or side by side. And all of those create different types of earthquake. So what happens during an earthquake is it moves in one direction. So it might be side by side, which we call a strike slip fault. It might be going down, because you get a subduction of a plate that goes down, or along the center of places like the Atlantic, you get the plates moving apart. So all of these will produce earthquakes. And in fact, we can actually work out where the edges of plates are based on where the earthquakes occur. So, well, let's start with the fault line. The fault
Yes.
line is really where a fault meets the surface. So a fault is a three-dimensional feature, which is a break in the rocks, which extends for a certain distance down. They eventually break. They eventually stop in some direction, some of them anyway. But they will, some of them reach the surface. And when they reach the surface, you get what we call a fault line, which you can actually see on the surface. And because different rocks have moved, what often you see in that situation is the rocks on one side of the fault line are different to the rocks on the other side. And you can't explain it as a normal geological process, it's got to be a break, and they've been put against each other. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you get a string of earthquakes, and they can just happen as a single one, but if you get a string of earthquakes, often one of them will be the largest, often quite significantly so. And that is the main, basically, earthquake. Now, anything that happens before that is a foreshock, and anything that happens after that is an aftershock. Now, if it had got a series of earthquakes that's going on and you've got lots of little ones, you might say, well, we've had an earthquake and such like, but then that turns out to be a foreshock if you get a bigger one later on. So it's really once you've seen the whole series of earthquakes that go on, that you can actually assign terms to it, like foreshock or aftershock. You don't have to have foreshocks. You can have earthquakes which don't have foreshocks. Well, let's start with it. We live on the Caribbean plate, across it. So from Trinidad through St. Vincent, up Puerto Rico, across to Jamaica, and into Central America. It's all part of the Caribbean plate. And the Caribbean plate is separated from the North American plate by a strike-slip fault, one of the side-by-side moving ones. Now, it's not a simple fault. It's a complex fault, and it's actually got two different main fault lines, if you like. So one of those comes through Hispaniola and south of Cuba, and then south of the Cayman Islands. The other one comes through southern Hispaniola, through Haiti, comes across through Jamaica, and becomes rather diffuse through Jamaica, and then joins up back with the one south of Cuba at what we call a spreading center, one of these places where the plates are moving apart. And so that defines a little sort of microplate, as we call them, which is the Gonave microplate, it's called. And you get earthquakes on both of those major fault lines. So particularly the ones in the Dominican Republic, and we had a 7 about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, which was on that fault line between Cuba and the Cayman Islands. And that one had a lot of interest with it because it was very big. And then, of course, the southern bit, you've got the southern fault line. That's the one that's caused the earthquakes in Jamaica, but also the earthquakes in basically in Haiti. The 2010 earthquake in Haiti was on that fault line as well. So really, when we talk about it, we've got this big set of faults which are sort of running east-west. Now, they aren't necessarily straight. Wiggle. Okay. Now, if they wiggle one way, when you get movement along them, they cause extension. The different bits of plate move apart, and that gives you basins. But if they wiggle the other way, they're compressional, and that gives you mountains. So the Blue Mountains are one of these uplifts associated with one of these wiggles in the fault. So what you get is you get these strings of east-west faults, and then you get the wiggle ones, which are northwest, southeast, which cause uplift. So you've got these different sets of faults, and there are quite a few different ones across Jamaica. So the Blue Mountains is basically got a series of these northwest, southeast ones, and that's what's progressively lifting it up. And it's going up at about 2 millimeters a year. Doesn't sound a lot, but over time, of course, it is. When you talk about millions of years, yeah, it goes a long, long way. And you've got these others, which are basically east-west ones. And the one coming in from Haiti, when it comes into Jamaica, is called the Plantain Garden Fault. And that comes in and then curves up, parallel to the Blue Mountains ones. And then you've got two further east-west faults, one which is a central Jamaican fault, and one which is along the south coast. And the one along the south coast is the longest. And that's significant, yeah, because the longer a fault, the larger an earthquake it can produce. The south coast. It's basically south of St. Thomas. It extends south of Kingston. It comes onshore to basically in Clarendon, where you've got Portland Ridge to the south of it, and you've got the Vere Plains to the north of it, and then it goes back along the basically the south coast of Manchester and St. Elizabeth, and then runs off into the sea again. I think the south coast fort, to my mind, is probably the most dangerous because it's the longest. But you also can't discount the Plantain Garden because it does stretch over to Haiti as well. So although we got the termination of it, it's still quite a long fault, and certainly a very long fault. So both of those are capable of generating magnitude 7 earthquakes. The last year or year and a few months, we've seen 3 successive earthquakes with aftershocks as well. But 3. The first one was really pretty much on the Plantain Garden at a 4.9. That led to the 5.6 in the Blue Mountains, and then we had that 5.3, which actually is a fault cross-cutting the Wagwater. Now we got more data on it. And what you're seeing there is you're seeing these faults stepping towards the west, or the earthquakes on the faults stepping towards the west. Now, my concern would be that if this is basically carrying the stress across, this stress could be building up on that south coast fault. And if that south coast fault was to move, we would have a larger earthquake. And it's entirely possible that the Port Royal one was actually on that fault line. We don't know which fault line was, because of course, that's the science wasn't anywhere at the time to be able to understand things. So yeah, it could be as bad as that. But of course, we don't know the time frame. We don't know, is this going to continue, this series of earthquakes? Or, for instance, has the stress been released? In the movements, has this been released? If it's been released, we may go back to a status quo of, not too much happening. But I think what you've got to do is you've got to make people aware that these things can happen. It's much better being aware that things can happen and make plans. You can't stop the earthquakes, just like you can't stop a hurricane, but you can make plans to make sure that your people, your families are prepared for this and safe as far as they can be. That we will get one, just as other parts of the Caribbean will also get large earthquakes. It's just going to be, because this is what the geology tells us. We know what the geology of the Caribbean is, even if we're still working out its fine details. But we know where these big fault lines are, and we know where they run through, and we know at some point there will be big earthquakes again, because we've seen them in the past. So we have historical data. We may only have about 500 years of it, but we've had very large numbers of earthquakes all around the Caribbean plate in that time. So yes, we are going to see at some point a big earthquake. Now, you can't predict them. That's the trouble. We can't predict when they're going to happen. We can't see the stress building up. The only time we know the stress is built up is when it gets released. This is the problem. So it's not an easy situation to actually understand that. I mean, the one we had, the 5.6 we had in basically late October, that did not have a foreshock. It did not have a foreshock at all, and then there were hundreds of aftershocks afterwards. So you don't even get a warning necessarily of a foreshock sometimes. So that's one of the problems. But we if we look around the Caribbean, we have different sorts of faults around the Caribbean, but they all can cause the same sorts of problems. And of course, there are other things associated with that. There are also things like tsunamis. You get tsunamis basically created by different things. If a fault is underwater, it can displace the water, and you get a wave that is created in that case. But it can also be that you get underwater landslides. So if you get a landslide underwater, again, it displaces water, and that will basically create a wave which will go and potentially cause damage. Equally, you can get it associated with volcanic eruptions or collapses on the flanks of volcanoes. So there are a whole different number of ways that you can actually generate tsunamis. And of course, they can be tele-tsunamis, they can travel a long way, and you may not feel the earthquake that's associated with them, but they can still cause damage. So it's yeah, I mean, really, it's buildings that are buildings out of concrete are basically it's how they've been designed. So if you can design to withstand large earthquakes, and of course, each time there is a big earthquake, so places particularly like Japan, places like Chile, where they have very frequent earthquakes, they are the ones that are continually understanding because they see how the buildings are affected. And they say, well, we can't build like that in an earthquake zone. We've got to change the codes so that we can build buildings that are going to stay up. But the trouble is that if you look at somewhere like Jamaica, the building stock has not been tested since 1907. So it's not even if you're just building them today, you've got to worry about everything that's been built in the last 115 years. And it's a long time, and your building codes and your building practices would not have been the same in the past as they are today. So there's still a lot of buildings that are made out of bricks, for instance. So you're going to get different responses from different types of building. And in different areas. I mentioned the liquefaction and the fact that some of the areas are soft. You can actually get buildings sinking as well. So there are problems like that. There's the famous Giddy house here, which was tilted over and things like that. There are evidence. So number one is the building stock, and of course the building stock is problematic because of course people inside the buildings, are at risk if the building collapses. So that is the key sort of thing you've really got to think about is, okay, how do you get out of a building? How can you get out of a building? How do you make yourself as safe as possible in a building? But we've also got to think about other things. And the other sort of things is infrastructure. So roads, so any roads on mountainsides, you're going to get landslides. So even if buildings survive, you may have them cut off. And obviously, if you lose complete road systems, the only way of getting back into these areas is through something like helicopters. It's not straightforward after an event to actually move around those areas. The other concern is hospitals, fire stations, army barracks, things like this. They are often situated in the flat areas as well. So you may well lose a lot of first responders to an incident. And if they're not, even if they're not, they may not have the ability to respond back to it. So it's always the starting point immediately after one of these events that is the big problem, because you're going to have a certain period of time before anybody can come in. It usually takes about a week before you've got international aid that comes in. Yeah, we have done a series of modeling. Different people have done different types of modeling. So some people have modeled how building stock will basically react to an earthquake based on doing a quick assessment of what the building looks like, how many floors it's got, how it's designed, those sort of things, and then simulating an earthquake and seeing if it would stay up. Equally, a few years ago, we did a tsunami modeling where we used a tele-tsunami event in Panama and then looked at its effect on the south coast of Jamaica, particularly one area in Old Harbor Bay. That suggested that the run-up would be maybe 50 meters, which is quite a long way inland, particularly when people live within that 50 meters. But what this has actually moved towards is the putting up of tsunami warning signs and also installing sirens so that if there is a tsunami alert, people become aware of it. So this again is one of the important things. It's around the Caribbean there are several places which are actually doing this. Puerto Rico's done a lot of this as well, and so you've got this. And for the tsunami warning, everything for the Caribbean comes out of the Pacific. So the Pacific have the responsibility for issuing tsunami warnings in the Caribbean. And what they therefore have is they have access to the various earthquake stations, the seismic stations, so that they can immediately make basically they can immediately decide whether there is potential for a tsunami. And what they do is they issue an alert for a big earthquake regardless, and then they look at buoys out at sea to see if a wave's been generated. And if a wave hasn't been generated, they would cancel the warning. So there is a lot of science in this to actually try and keep people as safe as possible. But it does require you having this infrastructure in place and keeping it working. I mean, it's probably within about sort of 5 to 10 houses of the shoreline is typical. That sort of distance, okay? So, and particularly in flat coastal areas. I mean, the other concern, of course, is the flat coastal areas are where most of the hotels are as well. So there's also, I mean, that's the same with hurricanes. There's also an impact, obviously, when you get a hurricane, as you're well aware. So you've got to worry about these different sorts of scenario. I mean, flooding is flooding. It doesn't matter whether it's a tsunami or whether it's a hurricane. It's still flooding. Or it can be a depression. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be something that is given a big name to basically cause problems. I mean, a lot of the flooding occurs in Jamaica because it's mountainous. Is actually because we have just front systems come across and they drop a lot of rain, and they can overpower the river systems and cause significant. Well, it's very difficult to do this. I mean, we haven't really got into the idea of doing predictions for this because it's very difficult to work with this scientifically. There are a few things that are sort of being suggested as possibilities, and that is that some gases may be released prior to an earthquake, and that is something people are looking at. But really, at the moment, predicting earthquakes is a very, very difficult thing to do. Yeah. I think if people could, we would be in a much better position, but we haven't got that far. That's a really big question, and some people do feel that animals are sensitive to these things. I'm not entirely certain how that works, though. That is my concern about it. So I am generally not I think that people see something that the animals did after the earthquakes happened, and therefore they associate that with it. I mean, it's like when if somebody goes and predicts something's going to happen. Well, if you say, there's this thing about this, somebody was saying that there's going to be a planetary conjunction and it's going to cause more earthquakes, and it's not. But there will be an earthquake somewhere in that time frame. So somebody could say, well, there was an earthquake, and it's a spurious sort of correlation, I think. So I'm not entirely convinced that you can see that with earthquake. I think that you might be able to see that with other things. So, for instance, with hurricanes coming in, you might be able to see the pressure dropping and things like that. So you may have, some types of event might have something associated with them, which is a precursor, but invariably earthquakes don't. Well, earthquakes are relatively rare events, but they will happen. They're rarer events. Big ones are rarer events than hurricanes. So you've got to put them in perspective. And as I'm saying, well, we've seen a series of them in the last year or so, and that does raise some concern. But it's more about raising some concern, and that people should be basically wary that we could be heading towards another one, certainly a larger one. But what you should do with that is to balance that up with how you're going to plan for what you need. So in other words, you're going to need water, you're going to need food, batteries, things like this, first aid kits, all of these sort of things you're going to need. Now, people put them together for the hurricane season, but what you can do is to keep them running all year. And then if something was to happen, you actually do have something to fall back on, once, particularly, I mean, for instance, if your house is damaged, that sort of thing is important. So even having things like tarpaulings available is actually a useful thing, because you can at least cover the house afterwards and things like that. Equally, it's when an earthquake hits that is an interesting time, because you've got a different scenario if it hits during the day or the night. If it hits during the night, everybody is at home. Most people, a lot of people at home, that's about. If it hits during the day, the majority of people are out. So children are at school, people are at work, students are at universities or colleges and things like this. That creates a problem if you damage the infrastructure, because if you lose your roads, people are going to find it much more difficult to travel. And you'll see, I mean, when we have one of them here, one of the small earthquakes here, everybody tried to go on the road at the same time, and of course it leads to blocks. Now, if you damage the roads on top of that, people aren't going to get around. And it's therefore much safer to stay where you are and to make plans with your family and your friends. Say, well, stay where you are. If the school is safe, stay at the school until we can work out the best way that you can come back, at a reasonable time and not be in traffic jams for 5 hours. So I think that this planning and talking about what you would do during an earthquake is an important thing. And I think that is the real preparation we can do is the planning of how to prepare for an earthquake and the aftermath of an earthquake. And then, of course, during the earthquake, you just got to try and keep yourself safe. And that really means protecting your head and your body. Wooden tables are good if you can get under a wooden table, because wood tends to be springy, so it doesn't basically. If concrete lands on top of it, it's not going to crack and come down invariably. If you've got a door jamb which is reinforced in some way, again the same thing. It's not so likely to come down. If you're near the exit to basically a house or a building, if you've got time, you can get out. People are a bit shocked when these things happen, but you can get out. If you're driving, you want to pull over on the side. If you're out on grass or something like that, it might sound funny, but what you do is you actually lie on the ground, because what happens is the actual waves come along and the actual ground moves as an actual physical wave. And if you're standing on it, it can throw you in the air and you can fall and break bones and things like that.